Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning where you are. Welcome to the One Voice COVID and Policy Developments update from Washington, D.C. My name is Paul Nathanson. I'm with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. As always, my colleagues Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik are with me. We have a great deal to update you today. A lot has happened in Washington, including late breaking developments this morning with the House passing their Build Back Better infrastructure bill. So today we're gonna start with some federal agency actions regarding vaccinations, mask mandates, and such. Then we'll talk a little bit about the infrastructure reconciliation bill, talk about how they're planning on paying for all this with some tax provisions that will be of interest to you. And then since we last talked to you, there's been some activity on steel and aluminum tariffs and trade, and we'll update you on that. So let me turn it right over to Omar because we have a lot to cover. So Omar, take it away.
Thanks so much, Paul. To your point there, we are going to do a few things here with regards to the agencies, but we're going to run through them kind of quick because we know most people do want to talk about the OSHA vaccine mandate, and John's got some good updates there with regards to what's happening, and we'll give you some insight into the legal steps and what's there. But for right now, we quickly want to just show you a couple of areas for reference with regards to the updates. CDC on its workforce and workplace business reference webpage did do a couple of updates, and they're specific for when you are going in your HR department, you're going through a vaccination status, you're doing your investigation and going through the responding process. In many cases, what you have to do under OSHA and under CDC is start investigating whether or not an item was related or infection was related, work related. Those areas are now included. Now you can they've also included vaccination status in terms of the items that you're going to be looking at when you're conducting an investigation and interviewing cases and contacts in the workplace through that standard questionnaire that has been out for some time. As you can see there, the contact tracing, that's what they mean. They've also included vaccination status monitoring in when you're looking at responses. And that's just an update there. For those of you that do have those questionnaires, you may want to keep that in mind for the future as well. There hasn't been that much otherwise that's been updated, but we did want to make sure you have the easiest link to get right to any information from the CDC, and it does say November 4th. But even on that November 4th update, most of it was really minor. It was that October 25th would be more of my focus point. There's our suggestion. A couple of things that have come up here, we just want to give you some references. And John, if you want to jump in just overall on the federal contractor vaccine mandate, that's one that we are hearing does seem like the legal challenges, John, probably aren't going to be nearly as strong and as capable that are out there, but they did update their guidance on the FAQs there.
Yeah, originally, the federal government had indicated for federal contractors it would take effect, I think it was December 8th, but when they expanded the vaccine mandate, they put them both starting beginning of next year. And so they did issue some frequently asked questions. For example, so the question is, if you're a federal contractor, if you're in a federal facility or you're a subcontractor or something, do you have to follow the same protocols? And so they did indicate in this frequently asked question that yes, no matter what facility you're working in, maintaining the same protocols, whether you're in a federal facility or another covered facility that's doing federal work as a contractor. They also clarified is if you're a federal contractor and there has to be, mask mandates and distancing and the vaccines and the testing and such, can you give us some guidelines for signage and stuff? And so here's an example where the artists at OSHA have put forth some suggestions for signage for mask mandates and other signages. Is that if you do have the vaccine, you don't need to maintain the 6-foot distancing, but if you do, if you're not vaccinated, you must be masked and maintain that 6-foot distancing. So these are just two examples they put forward to provide guidance to manufacturers.
And that's a key point, a key phrase there for the federal contractors, because the initial executive order did not include manufactured goods, but we're hearing increasingly about contracts outside of DoD, especially being amended to include some of those items that were not covered. And even if you aren't covered by the federal contractor mandate, we have seen letters from both NTMA and PMA members from their clients, from their customers, asking them questions about their compliance with it. Our understanding is on the DoD side, those contracts are not being amended and cannot be fully amended without a restart. I don't want to say that too definitively, but that's what the lawyers are telling us, that you're not seeing the DoD contracts being necessarily amended for inclusion, but we are seeing the contractors such as the primes are still telling a lot of their customers, or the suppliers rather, and asking about whether they're complying in vaccination. We did even hear about a customer, again, suppliers to Tyson's Foods also being asked about that. And so watch out for your OEMs. We're increasingly, just as we always predicted, some of those larger publicly traded companies are going to be asking about the vaccine mandate status within some of their supply chains to prevent future disruptions, even as we do have some of the legal challenges that are out there. OSHA does have a new webpage that is your one-stop shop. We'll provide this link also separately in the summary that goes out after this to all registrants, but this is where you'll be able to find everything from your FAQ to different policy templates and samples that you can put out and print out and use depending on the conversations you all are having internally on the approach and speaking to the attorneys and how you'd like your own attorneys and how you'd like to take that. These next number of slides, we're not going to go through what they are. And similar when we get to EEOC, this is rather for you to know that it's there. For those that are starting to work on some type of response for this, this will essentially show you on their FAQs what you need to know. They're pretty basic when you open them up, and they'll explain. Some of them are one paragraph, some of them are a sentence, some a bit more. But you'll see that they do go in through a number of details in terms of how the state is affected by, let's say, Texas or other laws that prohibit. Obviously, as expected, federal law supersedes. That's what obviously the FAQ will state in there. We've been told by OSHA this is being updated in real time, and that's why we did want to show you that some of them are out there. But John, this does take a lot of impact, and there's still a lot of questions. You'll see in here the FAQ does get into what about side effects, what about paid leave, sick leave, and that's what you'll see, John, in this one, some of those slides here as well.
Yeah, and to your point, and we will send you as a follow-up email, some key links to look into it. But this is a slide deck that when it eventually gets sent out to you, or we do recommend you print it out, because there's a lot of good, valuable links on here. And for example, this is one. If you do have the mandate and you do require the vaccine, and if your employee has a side effect, who's responsible for the sick leave? And they did clarify that the employer can require paid time off initially to be utilized, but that is just one specific example of in these frequently asked questions. Can an employee who is not vaccinated, but oops, I forgot to get tested today or this week, can that employer come to work? Can that employee come to work even if he's masked and working remotely? And another one of those, suggestions and frequently asked questions was no. If you cannot produce a weekly negative test, COVID test, that you're not allowed to work with your coworkers, in the work environment.
And you've got to be careful on the testing requirement of what is a valid test. Are you seeing them take it if it's a rapid antigen test? If it is the more PCR that's coming from a health provider, that's a little bit more easy to validate, but this is going to be a tricky area. And not just that, if you are going to be supplying the test, we strongly encourage you, especially if you're in a remote area, start looking into it now if you have not already, in terms of where you're going to find all these tests. We do know the administration has increased funding and increased areas with regards to the opportunity to get some of these supplies, but that still is going to be slow going. A couple of other items before we start getting into the EEOC quickly. We did have a question. All of this applies to companies with 100 or more employees, correct, is the question. Let us parse this in a number of ways. As of right now, the way it is drafted, yes, it is for employee with 100 or more, but multiple states have already said they're going to go below. If you're in an OSHA state, such as our esteemed questioner from California, California can go much lower than 100 if it wants. There's already a lawsuit we'll discuss on a few slides here that has said that I'm in grave danger and I work at a place that's under 100 employees and you should lower that threshold. As of right now, your legal obligation looks at it from this one on the 100 is where the federal government came down. But if you're a federal contractor, you will have to comply with the federal contractor requirement. You can't, it's not an either or, which does not allow testing in that case. And that's why we're still hoping for more clarity from the courts. We tend to tell folks, try not to focus on that 100 threshold, as that is probably the loosest item in there. That is the most arbitrary and is very much subject to change.
Omar, I think we both agree that there's going to be a challenge over whether OSHA has the authority to even do the mandate. But once we get past that argument, the real decision that the court has to make is, does that 100 employee limit stand? Or, as you point out, does it drop? Does the court do that, or just do the individual states do that?
Oh, see, to me, I don't believe this is, if this ends up happening and staying, that's one thing. I don't believe that ultimately will stand, but I believe that you will have enough in the supply chains pushing it down to where you start getting a question about your vaccine status for your employees. And at that point, it's not you versus OSHA, it's you versus losing that customer potentially. That's just increasingly what we're hearing, and don't shoot the messenger. Again, FAQs, this is now on the EEOC side. There's a lot of discussion on religious exemption. We're not going to go through these. We're showing you that these have been updated very recently in the last several weeks with regards to the religious exemption update. You can see here, need to notify the employer that there's a conflict between their, this is the important phrase, sincerely held religious beliefs. That's the trigger. OSHA put out its own internal form that it uses for its own employees to say for their religious accommodation form, and this is about 2.5 pages. You can click on that link on the right and it will take you, and they're saying if you are going to, well, you do need to provide a religious exemption. They're trying to make it easy and saying, hey, here's our form, use it if you end up going down this pathway. Same thing, more, you should assume it is based on a sincerely held religious belief and not question the factuality. All of these are areas where you can go back later on and be able to go through it. As you can see, what's undue hardship, all of these have now been addressed with the most recent from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as you look through. And just the last few of them that we did want to flag here on this, you know, when it looks at the religious accommodations for some, for others, it's a case-by-case basis. You're not going to be able to do just a blanket accommodation across the board because that way there wouldn't be an undue hardship. There really wouldn't be anything if you did it for everybody. And that's where they're looking at it right now. And then the last couple of them here, again, must an employer provide the religious accommodation preferred if there are other possible accommodations? Well, they're saying no, because if you can provide that reasonable accommodation, then there is no conflict. And therefore, there's going to be a single accommodation that the employer provides, not the one that is preferred by their employee. That's there as well. And here's the last one before we start getting into the legal updates on the next slide. But again, if an employer grants a religious accommodation to an employee, can they later reconsider it? And you can continue to take into account changing circumstances, but pretty much, you know, once you put it there, it's going to be there. The slippery slope, we'll see what some of the legal arguments, because there definitely have been some that have been put in place. But John, you want to give us the quick TikTok here, starting with November 5th, the OSHA release?
Yes, so here the dates clearly state where things are. It was immediately, this vaccine mandate was immediately challenged by many attorney generals from across the country. This case was taken up in the federal court in New Orleans. The court issued a stay. That stay was reaffirmed by a larger 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans, and they basically forced OSHA to suspend the implementation of the vaccine mandate until it's ruled by further court. But as I said, this was challenged in I think every district around the country, and so that led to a judiciary lottery system. Essentially, is they put ping pong balls with a wooden barrel and picked out which federal court would take up this vaccine mandate, and with picking the right ping pong ball, it was selected that the Cincinnati district, the 6th district, would be the one that they would hear the case. So what does that mean? The 6th district, it will determine the schedule. When you look at the 6th district judges, there are 20 of them on the court that were named by a Republican president. There are 6 Democrats, 6 judges who were named by Democrats on the 6th district. And so that may give you an idea of where this district is to rule. We believe that the district will rule quickly, whether it's a 3-judge panel or they have the en blanc, have the entire district rule on this, because we do believe that all expectations are that this vaccine mandate will be taken up before the Supreme Court. So we do expect immediate action. We expect some decisions as early as December.
That's right. And this is the interesting timeline that we'll go in. We're going to get into the arguments made and the parties to the lawsuits in a minute. But this is a legal process that's got to run through. There's a few scenarios that we see here. The Sixth Circuit Court, to John's point, is not likely to lift the stay. So we do expect the OSHA mandate to continue to be suspended through the emergency stay. It's not an injunction, the stay that was done through the Louisiana Fifth Circuit. The Sixth could, on its own, either through the 3-panel or the en banc panel of the entire active judicial review panel, for when they do a motions hearing, they could on their own decide to lift the stay and allow it to move forward, but that is also unlikely. There will be a couple of steps here the federal government can take. The federal government can petition directly to the Supreme Court saying this is an emergency, we don't have time to go through a full motions hearing, let's just jump right to it. There is already a motions hearing scheduled for November 22nd in the Sixth Circuit that already had a hearing set for a case. That likely could get pushed, and there is also a motions hearing set for November 30th, also in that court as well. That'll give you the timeline of at least in the Sixth Circuit Court. From there, no matter what happens, we do expect an appeal to the Supreme Court. This is not my non-legal analysis, but estimate of how this is going to play out. You're going to get to this, they're going to petition the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will say, no, we're not going to hear it. However, we do believe, and regardless, they're not going to hear it. You're not going to have oral arguments where the people stand up in the court. That's not going to happen. This is all going to be done in writing. That's how the court handles things not on its docket. And so it'll move quickly through the Supreme Court on the side, all through paperwork and written arguments rather than oral. The Supreme Court will probably come back and say, you violated procedure. We're not going to rule on whether or not the federal government has the authority to do this. So if you want to do this, go back through the normal rulemaking process with public comment over a number of months, and then try to do it, and then go through the court system and have it be challenged on whether or not you've exceeded the authority. Supreme Court does that all the time. And in many ways, you will not, if you are the defendant on this one, the federal government, a Democrat, you might not want the courts to rule whether you have that authority or not, because you want to save that answer for another day. Then this thing gets passed. What OSHA will do will likely continue to move forward with that rulemaking if that's what the Supreme Court says. And by then, you could reach the end of the 6 months. Keep in mind that this emergency temporary standard expires automatically in May because it can only last for 6 months, which means the OSHA would have a certain amount of time to move forward and do it through the normal procedure. And in that time, what their hope would be that enough employers would have already adopted it that they would not need to move forward with the rule. That's where at least I see it playing out, and maybe others, because it does seem like there's a lot of legal arguments here on both sides of it. And John, we'll just talk about some of the parties. You mentioned the attorneys general, the Republican state government officials. Those aren't the lawsuits that we're focused on. We're more focused on the employer groups, the employee groups. As I mentioned, there's a lawsuit that's out there already been filed by unions saying that the employee threshold of 100 is too high. And to that point, we did get a question. If an employer has over 100 employees, but these employees are not in the same building, does the vaccine testing mandate apply? The answer is yes. If you have multiple facilities, even across state lines, you will need to add up all of those employees together to see whether or not you hit 100. It also applies for similarly controlled entities. That is another trigger point that we definitely know that some of you might hit that's out there. They have, however, provided quite a bit more flexibility than we thought they would with regards to testing. And that is that you could say have a headquarters building and have a testing only, allow for testing only there, but then have a mandate for vaccine in the retail operation. It was the example that they used in their FAQ. But John, there's a lot of challenges you can see here, from religious institutions to private schools that are making a number of arguments.
And that is why I agree with your assumption that when the Supreme Court takes a look at it, it's going to look at the process, not necessarily the authority of OSHA to implement the mandate. I personally think the religious exemption it could get them all caught up, but it is. I mean, to your point, this is on the fast track. The court is not going to hear this in full, but to your point that this was an emergency temporary standard, that the full standard could take effect in June. This buys the administration time to get more shots in the arms of the American people.
Yeah, and to bring and convince more of the larger employers to push it out. I think that's really what their part of their fallback strategy is, and I think you're already starting to see that in some of the comments that are out there. From the NTMA and the PMA standpoint, we did file formal comments on Monday afternoon, or it might have been Tuesday morning, with OSHA, asking them to delay and asking for more time to move forward and be able to look at this. That's a procedural step that the law firms have been asking us to do, and that's really the guidance that all of us lobbyists are following right now. Now that we do have a court that we have identified that procedure, the attorneys and those groups John and I just got an email about 11:15 with the latest from what they're expecting on the challenges from all sides with regards to it not being strict enough, being too strict, etc. I think you'll probably see two trigger points, some kind of court answers around December 5th or 6th, because that's the first compliance requirement for masks. And then you get another, hopefully more permanent, definitive answer by the time we get to the early new year. But this is not done yet. And the courts look for some more information, maybe on Tuesday, but more likely around November 30th. We'll really get a better sense of how the legal challenges will take place. From a well, let's tell you what the lawyers are telling us to tell you. If you believe that you will have to be subject to this, meaning 100 or more, they're advising to at least start thinking about building out the testing regime, how you're going to keep record keeping, all those requirements that are out there, and then being able to move forward. So watch those closely, and also make sure you're watching what your states do, as they also have the authority to take some steps that are out there as well.
And if you're between 50 and 100 employees, you should also be carefully looking at that as well. Of if that number does change, how are you going to implement it?
Yeah, John, we just wanted to quickly give them a couple items here. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a slide that we periodically look at to see, where OSHA is in their investigations, and this first slide shows you what are the areas that they do have the most investigations. I can't help but notice that lockout tagout is rather far down on that list, where slips and trips, and that's why there's been a focus at OSHA with slip, trips, and falls, because that's where most of the investigations are. And then the next slide, it gives you an example of, so we've heard rumors, that there hasn't been, because of COVID and because of lack of morale at OSHA, that not a lot of investigations are taking place. And so here, this is a slide shows how many actual investigators there are at OSHA doing the investigation that's necessary. And we do see this year that it is at near an all-time low.
Yeah, we actually sent this to somebody who's been very active in OSHA for many, many years, and we told them, no, this is not from the Onion. It's actually real. You do not see this incorrectly. There are fewer OSHA inspectors today under Biden than there have been in 40 years, but Biden's also pledged to double the number of inspectors that are out there. Okay, that'll wrap up where we were on agencies. I know many folks are anxious now to hear about what's coming next with regards to key terms and status of major bills. John, can you just give folks a little understanding of the difference between what a BBB is versus a BIF and all that?
Yes. So BIF is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, BIF. The 1.2 billion, we've called it the hard infrastructure bill. That's money for roads, bridges, ports, broadband, and such. That legislation passed the Senate in August. 16 Republican senators crossed the aisle and voted for that legislation. It passed the House on November 5th with, I think, 13 Republicans voting for it and the 5 squad members voting, squad Democrats voting against it. That legislation, the BIF, was signed by President Biden last week. The other bill, the BBB, the Build Back Better, also known as Budget Reconciliation, also known as Human Infrastructure, that's the $1.7 trillion bill that initially started at 3.5 trillion. Well, Bernie Sanders thought it was going to be $6 trillion. That legislation just passed the House of Representatives this morning. It is off to the Senate. We do know there's going to be changes in that legislation. One of the things holding up consideration of the bill were the moderate Democrats wanted a score from the Congressional Budget Office. Would this bill increase or decrease the federal budget deficit? CBO came out yesterday afternoon saying that this legislation would increase a budget deficit by $300 billion. However, CBO does not take into consideration what revenue the federal government would raise by increasing the number of people working at the Department of Treasury in tax enforcement. And so with that score, the moderate Democrats were comforted and voted for the bill that passed today. Every Democrat voted for it except one, and all Republicans voted against it. So that bill now goes to the Senate. What happens next? So the Congress is out next week for Thanksgiving. They come back the first week in December.
Yeah,
Well,
we'll get back to that in a few slides. We're going to just,
Okay.
we wanted here to make sure people understood the difference, and I think they've got that between Build Back Better. The infrastructure law is different from what John was just starting to get into. The infrastructure law is what we just said. It is law. That was signed by President Biden on November 15th. That is different from what they are dealing with right now. Roads, bridges, ports. This sends $550 billion in new federal spending for these new programs, with the remainder being spent to renew the existing roads, bridges, and other port projects that were approved in a bipartisan manner about 5 years ago. There's a bipartisan law, as we mentioned, passed in August by a vote of 69 to 30, and then passed again here recently in the US House. There's a number of ways for folks to start getting a better sense of what it means for their communities. As you can see with the number of spending and the dollar amounts that are going out, this is every 5 years, this is a bill that happens anyway. It's usually just, as you could see, normally in the $500 to $700 billion range is what it spends over a 5-year authorization period. This one added an additional $550 billion to deal with infrastructure. Here's where you can see, we just did a couple of quick examples on this slide, Ohio, and then Michigan. You'll be able to see the $12.8 billion, the floor that Ohio is scheduled to receive based on formulas. The other, if you click on that link for your state, it'll show you the fact sheet that has been created. It'll talk about the different money for airports, how much is for ports, how much is for bridges, as you can see, and it'll total up for Ohio at a little over or a little under 13, and same for Michigan. John, I know this is near and dear to your heart since you are a Michigander, but I'm not sure $10 billion will do it, but at least it'll start over there.
Well, people have been complaining about the Michigan roads for 20 years now, and so every little bit, I think seeing the road construction taking place next year to some will be a great relief in the state of Michigan.
One thing we want to flag for you before I turn it back to John on Build Back Better is on the employee retention tax credit, on which we lobbied to create. We worked with a Democrat from Orlando, the Blue Dog Coalition folks, and we're able to create that employee retention tax credit. And more importantly, we're able to amend it three times actually, to expand it to include the recipients of PPP loans that are forgiven, and then also to extend it a couple of times. As many of you have heard from us before, because this provision's been around since August, the new law that was signed, the bipartisan law signed on Monday, eliminates the employee retention tax credit retroactive to October 1st for the entire quarter. As we said in the past, it was a Republican idea to get rid of it at the same time that Democrats agreed to get rid of unemployment extension beyond September 6th. The reason this went away is not because people didn't like it or think it was useful. It generated $8.2 billion in just 90 days, which is a very, very high score. That's why they needed the cash for the infrastructure spending you saw on the previous slide. Two things to take in mind here. If you have been continuing to operate as if the employee retention credit is in effect post October 1st, you have to take a couple of steps. Talk to your CPA. There's going to be some amendments that have to be done for underpayments. You're going to have a 941 that you're going to probably have to file. And in many ways, you've got up to 3 years to deal with this, but the sooner the better. That would be the first step you take. The second one would be, let us know if this is an issue, because there is a small lobbying campaign that we and others are thinking about starting to say, okay, instead of having the employee retention credit be retroactive to October 1st, can we have it retroactive to November 15th, the day the law was enacted? So at least it cushions it for those companies that have continued to use the ERTC beyond October 1 because of that uncertainty. That's a nascent lobbying effort. We'd be interested in anybody's feedback on that and where we end up going. But just a heads up, please contact your CPA on the ERTC. You are advised by CPAs to now assume that it is not there in your best case scenario if we get a tweak to November 15. But John, back to you on what's in that Build Back Better, and this is why the Democrats have been wanting to get this done, which they did today in the House.
Yeah, so this is a $1.7 trillion bill. It includes universal pre-K for 4 and 5 years olds, extension of the child care tax credit, $55 billion in green investments, provides Medicare reimbursement for hearing issues at Medicare, does provide home health care. There's a number of dollars in here for workforce development. And when just before the bill passed the House of Representatives, Speaker Pelosi put in paid family medical leave in the Build Back Better bill. That the paid back leave provision is one provision that is getting significant pushback, specifically from Senator Manchin in West Virginia. And so we'll wait and see where this is. But Omar, while they spend a lot of money, this bill also raises a lot of money in some controversial ways.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to get into a little bit of where they are, but as you take a look at the White House, what they put out in terms of their expectations of the revenue raisers, that's code for tax increases. The one thing that is not on here due to lobbying efforts, and in the end, one senator from Arizona, the 26.5% tax rate for C corporations, it was not included. That's $540 billion that they thought they would have for their spending priorities that they do not have. As you can see where they ended up going, a number of different areas. We're not sure all of them are going to survive the Senate, and we'll talk about that. But just quickly, since they did not increase the C corporate rate from 21 to 26.5 in the House, in the bill they passed today, they had to look for some other areas to raise dollars. And about $320 billion raised over 10 years is going to come from a corporate alternative minimum tax. This is for book income of $1 billion or more, and that's basically about 128 companies. When they're reporting to their shareholders and they're bragging about how much they're bringing in, yet their tax rate is below 15% and sometimes zero, that's what this is attempting to capture. Again, this is a little bit tough to implement and rely on as a steady stream because you are relying on just a small handful of companies to pay this tax that's there. And the limitation on deduction for interest expense, that's something we have been working on quite a bit. We do think this one might end up staying in there when we get to the Senate side, but it's definitely not as bad as it could have been with regards to taxing many of our manufacturers on the pass-through side, even though we're not out of the woods yet, because we do know the Senate chairman of the Finance Committee is actively looking at ways to make changes to those pass-through provisions. One area where you're going to hear Republicans saying, Democrats, you promised not to raise taxes on any earners under 400,000. Well, here's an area where you did. And technically, this will be correct. Net operating loss limitation. The Republicans in their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made some changes to NOL, and that we're going to revert back to norm in 2026. What Democrats are doing is they're sliding that up and they're making it retroactive to earlier. And on what it could end up capturing is the 262,000 earners or more there. And that's how you're technically going to potentially hit on those of you that are still using the NOL moving forward and how to get that retro. And that's where they get some of the dollars. But John, this provision on SALT, I do not think is going to survive the Senate. Do you?
No, this is caused consternation within the House and the Senate among Democrats. Here, the SALT provision was put in place due to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts, which limited the state and local tax deduction to $10,000. Well, members of Congress in high tax states, New York, New Jersey, California, argued that it's harmful and the SALT deduction needs to be increased. Well, what they did in this bill is they increased it from $10,000 to $72,000. So now you've got Bernie Sanders says, wait a minute, we're giving tax cuts to the wealthy. If we're going to increase the SALT deduction for joint filers to $72,000. And so as this bill limps over to the Senate, I already mentioned the hesitation on the paid leave. This is another area where I do believe Bernie Sanders and maybe Joe Manchin may have similar views on limiting that SALT deduction. I think there probably will be an enhanced SALT deduction based on your income, but not necessarily a blanket large dollar amount, which puts those supporters of this in a vulnerable position of providing tax cuts to the wealthy.
Yeah. Again, we look at how policy is impacted by politics, and this is one of those. There's a few things that they're talking about here: suspension of the SALT, a further limitation on eligibility, and so this isn't quite done yet. To John's point, when we get into it, a few other quick items on taxes. This is one we're not entirely sure whether or not it survives. But on Build Back Better does include a 4-year extension for the R&D tax credit. As you all know, on January 1st, it's going to pivot into amortization per the Republican tax law signed in 2017. We've been obviously lobbying for an extension. Congressman John Larson from Connecticut, a Democrat, inserted in a September 14th Ways and Means markup language here that would extend it for another 4 years, basically preventing the amortization from beginning until January 1, 2026. On this one, if it gets bounced, we'll still see a chance of it getting extended in a tax extenders bill. But if it got bounced out, it'd purely be for a cost situation. So we are pretty confident of what's going on with regards to the tax extension for the R&D tax credit. We're pretty hopeful there. But John, why don't you give us, when do you think this is going to get done? I mean, now that we're out of the House, you saw that we had only one Democrat, Jared Golden of Maine, voted against it. Obviously, all Republicans voted. We're not going to deal with the changes that the Senate wants. I mean, most of us tax lobbyists think that the Senate's going to be writing the final tax provisions in here. All right, what's your crystal ball? Is this Christmas? Is it next year? What happens?
I think it's probably going to end up being next year. When you look at the calendar, next week the Senate is not in session because of Thanksgiving. They come back the first week of December, and guess what expires? Government funding expires on December 3rd. So they need to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funding. Speculation is a lot of Senate Democrats want to extend government funding at last year's level to December 17th, while Senator Shelby, the Republican on the Appropriations Committee, wants to extend government funding at last year's levels to some point in the future next year. In addition, Janet Yellen has indicated to the Senate leadership on a bipartisan basis that, hey, you better take care of this debt ceiling thing. You guys did a temporary punt on the debt ceiling, but that debt ceiling needs to be addressed. And I think she'd indicated sometime in mid-December, the government's credit card is going to run out of money. And so that will need to be dealt with. Both of those issues in 1 week is gargantuan. It would be a gargantuan effort to get them successfully moved, which is why they won't have time till probably the earliest, the second week of December, to take up this Build Back Better bill, which has problems of its own. So that additional 2 weeks, the Thanksgiving next week and the first week of December, may give Senate Democrats and Senator Manchin and Sinema time to negotiate and talk through what their differences are. Manchin has made it pretty clear, especially after the most recent inflation numbers that were released, that he is not excited about, he doesn't feel the need to move a bill in this calendar year, and has indicated, well, he's indicated that he could be done this, he could go along with this year, or he, and the others sometimes have said he's willing to wait till next year. Why don't we do it next year? So, my crystal ball is it'll probably sometime in January, and it'll be a much smaller bill.
Well, I think we still end up at a $1.5 trillion measure at some point. The Democrats will need this. Frankly, I think it's better politics for them to do it next year, so they have something to show when they're out there campaigning and trying to drum up their base to actually show up in the midterms. But regardless, we think it will happen at some point, and you have to look at some of the other items. The taxation of pass-throughs is something we're still continuing to sprint and lobby on the Senate side with the Finance Committee, rather, as that's a big focus there. The NIIT, the investment tax, that I do believe will be increased there. They're still trying to come up with a way to tax unrealized gains, and that they haven't quite figured out what they're going to be able to put through yet. I do believe there'll be a limitation on the interest deduction. Anybody dealing with 163J, that's probably going to have a little bit. Not many of our companies, you might have a few that have some foreign ownership, so watch out for 163N. And especially 163N, I definitely know that Finance, the Senate staff are talking about making tweaks to that to change some of the depreciation that's allowed in there, or the deduction that's rather allowed that's in there. So be careful in watching out for in those areas. We had one question come in. What about negotiating pharma costs for Medicare? They're not making as much progress on that, in that the political opposition is pretty strong from pharma. They're saying that if you take this away from us or put in the ability to negotiate costs, then we're not going to be able to have the resources to develop things like the Pfizer vaccine and so on and so forth. So for that, I just don't know if the political will is still there. But in the interest of time, as we're already at 12:40 and we'd like to wrap, Paul, do you want to just give us a little overview here of what is going on in steel and aluminum and the announcement that has been made and the progress, so-called progress that they're claiming they've made?
Sure. The U.S. and EU announced agreement a couple of weeks ago that prevented the number one, the EU from doubling its tariff on U.S. exports in retaliation for the Section 232 tariffs. They were scheduled to go up to 50%, including Kentucky bourbon and some other, and Harley Davidson targeted exports. In return, the U.S. agreed to change the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs to a tariff rate quota. A tariff rate quota is you allow a certain amount of steel in to the country tariff-free, and then when it hits an agreed-upon limit, then you apply the tariff to it. TRQs are not ideal from our perspective. They could lead to a lot of manipulation of the market. Commerce is going to now have to monitor 50 some odd product lines. We have a lot of questions for Commerce that we're going to go in and ask them. So stay tuned for that. But in the end, that ended the dispute that was really sticking in the craw of the Europeans. Right away, the same day, the U.S. agreed that they were entering into negotiations with Japan, which they have started. We expect a similar kind of agreement, but no word yet on what's going to happen there. So, I think it's a good news that the tariffs have ended. Not so good news that they're replaced with tariff rate quotas. It's certainly not ideal, but we are making progress.
Yeah, that's the EU is a 27-member bloc. It's important to identify that Switzerland is not a member, and they do export a good amount of specialty metals that some of our members, particularly in medical device manufacturing, may use. So watch out for that. But I would also like to point out here, what is going to be the impact on you all? We still do expect the U.S. to be the highest priced market for metals in the world. We believe that this tariff rate quota system Paul described to you will really mostly benefit the European mills, because they're now faced with a situation where they can sell into the highest priced market in the world. And when instead of that 25% tariff going to the US Treasury, they can now charge a higher price and they'll reap a higher profit. We've asked the question to Commerce and USTR, are they going to take those new profits they're making off of us and going to be investing it in new capacity? Obviously, that's not something they're going to answer. But the way this scheme is going to work is the European Union, we've got 3.3 million metric tons. And so keep in mind that it's European under the metric ton side, which is what you're looking at on the steel. And on aluminum, it's about 386 when you look at unwrought and wrought aluminum, 1,000 tons, metric tons when it comes in. And the 3.3 million on the steel side, the EU is going to allocate it to each of its 27 members. Then each country is going to make an allocation either through their industry trade association or on their own to each mill, how much they can export. So if you are bringing in from Europe, it's strongly recommended you start talking to them now and get a better sense of what their allocation might be, because that will help determine what your suppliers and your service centers are going to be receiving and what you will be receiving. This is not an absolute quota like you have in South Korea, where once you hit that limit, no more is permitted in, but it is an area where the tariff rate quotas, our concern is smaller manufacturers and smaller buyers of metals will be the ones paying the 25%. Steel is done on a quarterly basis. Aluminum is done on an annual quota system, with no more than 60% of the aluminum being able to be purchased in the first 6 months of the year, reserving 40%. So now just think that through on both the aluminum and the steel side. You obviously are going to have the larger buyers with the purchasing power able to go in and make those buys before the 25% quota limit starts going in for the tariffs, and same for the 10% aluminum. Where does that leave many of those smaller businesses that are less of a priority for that service center or that mill? Probably the ones likely to end up paying those tariffs. That's our concern. We definitely would welcome the input from this group to get a better sense of what you're seeing out in the market. Because Paul, I do know that this is generating a good amount of attention through some of the work that your group has been doing over at CAMMU and elsewhere.
Yeah, and one other item from your previous slide, Omar, is that today news report said that South Korea has asked now to start negotiations now that they're seeing that the administration is negotiating tariff rate quotas instead of absolute quotas. They want to revise the deal. But the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users, you can see the response that we had. This NTMA and PMA are our founding members, among others, expressing the concern regarding Omar's point just before that. Often small and medium-sized manufacturers are the ones that lose out here because the larger manufacturers play the game and fill up the quotas. So it puts us at a disadvantage. So we are scheduling meetings with the administration to make this point and to emphasize our concerns regarding the TRQs. That the press release that I just showed you resulted in some media inquiries, including the Wall Street Journal, which ran a quote from both the press release and from a PMA member here, Politico, among several other publications. So, our group has become really the most prominent spokespersons for the steel and aluminum using manufacturers.
We did get a question here before I turn it over to John to close us out. How large are the quota amounts compared to historical imported volumes? They ended up going back and they took a 3-year average for steel side. They used, I believe it was 2015 to 2017. I think it was a 3-year average that they took. And that's how they got to the starting point of 3.3 million metric tons. The briefing that we received from USTR and Commerce, was it maybe last week or the week before? I think it was last week. They basically said that was difficult for them to come up with. The Europeans obviously wanted much, much more. They felt that based on what the domestic mills here were telling them and future demand, they factored in a couple of demand items to increase and some cushions, that this was the right number that they could get to on the 3.3 million metric tons. They do allow a couple of surges. If you do have a number of increases over the years, year over year, they will allow up to potentially a 4% increase in the quotas. If there's a certain amount of quota that's left, they'll allow you to increase the quota for the following quarter by the 3%. So if you've got 6% increased demand, they'll allow for an increase of 3%. And they'll allow some rollovers as well of up to 4% rollover into the next quarter if there's excess before they do the increase. We still believe it's too low, and that goes to a question that, John, I'll throw even to you, that came out here is, do you have an updated estimate of how much steel tonnage the bipartisan infrastructure framework will require over its full term? John, that's been one of our big concerns. And
yeah, absolutely. We have, when we talk to policymakers on the Hill, while they are sympathetic, specifically a lot of Democrats, they're sympathetic to us on the steel and aluminum tariffs, but then we say, but this infrastructure bill is going to, it could have a serious impact on the availability of steel. Our guys lower on the pecking order from the large industrial companies out there. And so they do understand it. We don't have a sense yet of exactly how much steel and aluminum and iron is going to be utilized as part of the BIF program, but we do know that we do not expect much of a reduction by lifting of the tariffs. We're already saying not much of a change in the price of steel and aluminum. Omar or Paul, I think it was like a 2.5% savings, which is nothing. But once they start implementing and putting shovels in the ground and start building these roads and bridges, we do foresee continuing challenges on availability and some price concerns.
That's really where my personal concern is going to be. It's going to be more on the market manipulation And that's going to be the concern of where some artificial pricing will be because of speculation of demand. A lot of that demand is going to be in more different types of steel than a lot of our members use. But overall, if that's going to push out some of the production that the mills do and give that higher priorities, that will certainly impact. But I believe that most of it will likely be more from a market manipulation and a pricing structure rather than an immediate shortage saying starting tomorrow. The timing for many of these projects, the money still has to be transferred, which will happen in about 3 weeks to the transportation account that needs it. And then from there, you'll start seeing projects trickle out in probably about 6 months or so, in 4 to 6. So you still have some time, but we expect that those that are buying steel now for 6 months later should really start thinking if there's going to be some additional artificial pricing inflation. To John's point, only 2.4% has gone down. And as we get ready to wrap up, as always, you can stay connected with us on the One Voice podcast. And in between this one, we will have another one of these webinars again on December 17th, I believe is that Friday, also at noon Eastern. And that will be the final one for the year. I don't think you all want to hear from us over the holidays, but you can still, as always, with the podcast and any donations, any help and support, you can continue to provide to the trade association so we can make sure we're bringing you the most up-to-date content. Is always appreciated. Here's where you can find the links to the advocacy programs for both associations that can come from a company donation, and is always much appreciated. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions. We know we ran a little bit over with a lot of content today. The hope is you can be able to take these slides back, share them, and use them as a reference point and click on the links. Any questions? And as always, feel free to type them in on the right-hand side in the box, and we'll have you take them there or offline at another time. Don't see any yet we haven't gotten to, but we'll give folks maybe just another 15 seconds or so. Type one in. Don't see anyone. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Stay tuned. You should get some more updates from both groups in the coming weeks, and we will talk to everyone again on Friday, December 17th at noon Eastern.